Yes, my father was a master mariner. I grew up in a seafaring household, and we were chatting about that a little bit over the break and what that was like. So I'm delighted to be here today, and thank you so much for organising it, Sophia and Catherine, and anyone else that was involved in the organisation. But it's really fantastic that this is happening. It's quite unusual in the shipping industry to have a whole day around mental health, so it's completely brilliant. So thank you very much for inviting me. As you said, my father was a captain on container ships. He worked for P&O his whole career, went to sea when he was 16 and retired at retirement age. So he was at sea his whole life. As a mental health professional, I qualified about 25 years ago. I worked in specialist trauma services in London for about 8 years. And then I went into the humanitarian sector. So I worked in what they call hostile environments, where security is such that you're not able to go out. So I have some sort of lived experience of living and working in the same place, living with the people that you're working with, and not being able to go out of an evening or to unwind, and not having easy access to communication with friends or family or your social support network. So it feels like I have a little bit of lived experience of what it might be like to live in that kind of situation, as we all do, of course, following the pandemic and lockdown. But so I started to get involved in maritime mental health when the ITF Seafarer Trust did a conference back in 2017, 2018, 2019, can't remember now. But actually I was invited to speak about the way that we did mental health and psychosocial support in the humanitarian sector. So the ITF Seafarers Trust at that stage was saying, look, nobody's doing anything around mental health in the shipping industry. And they were looking to other sectors to see what we did. And I had been working in the humanitarian sector. So Médecins Sans Frontières invited me to come and speak at the conference, and the only reason I came was because my father was a seafarer, and I thought, that could be an interesting day out. I'll hear a bit about the shipping industry. And then it grew and grew, and I started off doing a bit of pro bono work with iSwan. You probably know of iSwan, and I wrote the series of good mental health guides for seafarers. That was where I started. So things have kind of moved on from there. What I wanted to do today really is talk about what a mentally healthy environment on board a ship might be. And I thought it might be useful to really start with thinking about, what mental health is, and Sandra's already covered some of that, but also thinking about why would you be interested in mental health and well-being for seafarers. There is, of course, an ethical consideration. So seafarers are the most valuable asset that any shipping company has. Shipping can't happen without seafarers. Even in this age of new technology and automation and all the rest of it, we aren't there yet, are we? Will we ever be in a situation where we have no people on board? Fewer and fewer people might create bigger challenges rather than fewer challenges. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But what do we do with our most valuable assets? We take care of them, don't we? So we really need to think about how do we take care of seafarers. But above and beyond that ethical argument is a legal argument. We have a legal duty of care towards people that we employ. So, of course, the maritime industry is unique in very many ways, but one of them is that it's a global industry. And so, as you will all know far better than me, the legalities and kind of what applies where and to who and so on, the MLC, under Title 4, talks about health and well-being support. when I wrote Mentally Healthy Ships back in 2018, published in 2019, I think it was, just before the pandemic, we actually approached the MLC, the ILO, and said, I was a bit hesitant about what we should put in there about legal duties of care. And so I was being slightly hesitant, and Caitlin Vaughan, who was working with me, was overseeing the project from ISWAN, got in touch with them and said, what can we say and what can't we say? And they rewrote that section for us with far more direct language than I had been comfortable saying. They said unequivocally, everything that applies to health applies to mental health in the MLC. Unfortunately, it doesn't actually say mental and physical health, and it would be great if it did. But they said it applies. So any signatory of the MLC has a duty under Title 4 to consider mental health. And I think for me, often, what's a really useful paradigm is to think about the parity between physical health and mental health. So if we have something in place, or a policy or a procedure or a system or a response mechanism, whatever it is, if we have that in place for physical health, we need the equivalent in terms of mental health. So achieving that parity between mental health and physical health for me is where we need to get to. We know some of this stuff around kind of how mental ill health will contribute to potential problems on board the vessel, and I'm sure you all have a wealth of experience of that. If we can support seafarers, they're likely to perform better, they're likely to work better in teams, they're likely to communicate more effectively, they're likely to maintain concentration and focus for longer, more effectively. They're likely to be able to concentrate better, be less distracted, stick to the safety protocols, react in emergencies more effectively. If you're mentally well, you're much more on it, aren't you? And I'm sure all of you have experience of that. When we're stressed out, we've got stuff going on in life, it's hard to focus on what you need to focus on. It's actually part of the reaction to stress. If you think about the fight, flight, freeze reaction to stress, stress is a normal response to a threat or a danger or something that's going on. We are biologically programmed to attend to that threat. So it's actually really difficult to then put that on one side and focus on what you need to be focusing on. And I'm sure all of you have got experience of that. We all have stressors going on in life, don't we? And there are times when our mind is distracted by what's happening outside the actual, what we're supposed to be focusing on right now. So if we prioritise mental health, the idea is that we can reduce risks and incidents. If we can increase psychological safety, for example, people are more likely to feel that they can speak out if they notice a safety issue on board. It applies both to safety and to mental health and to any other issues that might be happening on board. If people are frightened to speak out, if there isn't a sense of psychological safety, then they won't speak out. And so problems and incidents and issues going on are less likely to be picked up early and acted on. But you need that culture on board, don't you, so that people feel confident that they can talk. They can say, look, I've noticed this problem over here, that they're not going to get lambasted for doing that. So the other big thing, of course, is that if we think about prevention, if we think about promotion of mental health and prevention of mental ill health, then we should be able to avoid crisis situations occurring. of course, that is the biggest problem, isn't it? I'm sure for you, that actually, if we only hear about a problem when it becomes a crisis, we're already at the point where somebody needs to be repatriated, for example. That's a hugely expensive way of managing mental health. So if we can put things in place to pick it up early, then we can prevent a number of those incidents. We're not going to catch them all, I'm sure, but we should be able to reduce the risk of those major incidents. I'd also draw your attention to that line at the bottom there around cost savings. Deloitte have done an analysis of the return on investment. They think that the work that they've done collating mental health interventions in employers, and this figure comes from their UK work, but they've also worked internationally and globally. They believe there's a £5 return on every £1 investment in mental health. There's slightly different figures for the degree of intervention or the complexity of intervention, but even for the most basic interventions around kind of just putting up posters, putting out, campaigns, the really easy, cheap, quick stuff, there's a £4.80 return on investment. So, it doesn't need to be massively expensive or complicated. There is a lot that we can do, a lot that we can achieve. Now, Sandra's already covered this, but sometimes it can be quite useful just to have a little bit of repetition. So I'm not going to talk a lot about it. But as she said, mental health, if you look at the World Health Organization's definition, it's defined in the positive. So it's about us being able to reach our potential. It's about being able to be fruitful, productive, cope with day-to-day stresses, and make a contribution to our community. When I first started working in the maritime industry, there was a lot of conflation around mental health and mental illness and what it is we were actually talking about. And a lot of people saying, look, we don't need to be thinking about this because seafarers are professional, they're strong. They don't need to think about mental health. They don't have these kinds of problems. And for that reason, what I've tended to talk about is psychological well-being rather than mental health, because mental health often has quite negative connotations for people. They often think of mental illness when we're talking about mental health. Actually, the concept of mental health and psychological well-being are largely interchangeable. So when, as mental health professionals, we're thinking about mental health, we're thinking about the whole continuum. We're not just thinking about illness. What's really critical to know is that we all have mental health. And Sandra said this earlier, but we all have mental health. I have mental health, you have mental health. Every person in this room has mental health. It lies on a continuum. It's exactly the same as physical health. We don't have one group of people over here that have physical health and then the rest of us, do we? We all have it. Some days it might be good. Some times in life it might be good. Other times in life or other days might not be so good. So there's this continuum, isn't there, that actually on any given day you might be struggling with a cough or a cold, or you might get COVID, or you might, God forbid, get a serious physical illness, a life-limiting disease. But we all have physical health, don't we? Most of the time we're not too bad and we're able to function, we're able to work. But also some of the time we might be at our peak physical fitness. Maybe you've been training to run a marathon or climb a mountain or whatever is your preferred sport or whatever, and that time in your life you might be really physically fit. Most of the time, most of us are probably somewhere in the middle. It's the same then with mental health, that only about 20% of people are flourishing at any one time. So the flourishing people are the ones that are at their equivalent of peak physical fitness, so peak mental health, only about 20%. And I'm not naturally in that group, and I don't think many of us are naturally in that group, but I'm really interested in what helps people flourish. What can we do to put ourselves in that group? And I think most of us can do more. We can learn new techniques. We can focus on our health and well-being, our mental health and well-being more, and we can move closer towards the flourishing end. But again, like physical health, most of us will be somewhere in the middle most of the time. At the other end of the continuum is people with mental health problems or diagnosable mental health problems. About 1 in 4 people have a diagnosable mental health problem at any one time. And so that really talks about all of the different mental health problems. But when we talk about 1 in 4, we're often thinking about the commonly diagnosed mental health problems, and they are things like anxiety and depression. Sometimes other things are lumped in there as well, but those are the things we're commonly thinking about. Right down at the bottom end of the scale are the more what we call severe and enduring mental health problems, or severe mental illness. And those are things like psychosis, schizophrenia, personality disorders, bipolar disorder, these kinds of things. So they're the more long-term, more severe mental health problems. So severe and enduring, we often call them. Only about 1 in 100 people have a severe and enduring mental health problem at any one time in the population. Psychosis itself, or schizophrenia, forms of psychosis, only about 1 in 200 people will likely be diagnosed with a psychosis at any one time. So it's much less likely that we're going to see those kinds of things on board ships. It is possible, and I have come across a handful of cases over the last 6 years, but it's not common. It's not common. So if we think about the fact that we all have mental health, what is it that influences that mental health on a day-to-day basis? Often around the world, we think about mental health, we understand mental health in the context of what we call the biopsychosocial model. So there is a complex kind of interplay between biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors. So at any one time, it depends on the interaction or the interplay between those biological, psychological, and social factors. So biology, we're talking about things like your physical health, your genetics, the risk that you were born with on the propensity towards psychosis, for example. Gut health, there's more and more research about gut health recently and the impact of that on your mental health. So we've got these biological factors. Psychological factors are not about your personality. There's very, very little, if any, research out there that shows that some people, personality-wise, are more likely to struggle with their mental health than others. It's much more about what you've learned as you've grown up, as you've become an adult, what skills, what techniques, what strategies, what tools you have learned in order to cope with situations. So whether whether you've learned that actually it's okay to talk to people when you're struggling or when you're sad, that actually talking to somebody can be a useful thing to do. Is that something that you have learned in your life? So it's about the psychological factors are all about the skills, the strategies that you have learned as an individual. And of course we can intervene with that. We can teach strategies as well. It also refers to things like something we talk about in psychology is called the locus of control. So some of us kind of have an idea that we're in control of what goes on in our life, that we are able to influence what happens. Some people tend to think that actually it's much more up to the gods or in the stars or due to fate, and so we can be a bit different about our thinking around how much control do I have in my own life. It might also be influenced about mediating factors, for example, around kind of individualistic cultures and communal cultures. The way that we solve problems, the way that we approach life might be different. So those are the kinds of things we're thinking about in psychological factors. Social factors are an enormous gamut of different kinds of things, and that's things like the environment that you're in, your living conditions, your working conditions, your social support structure, whether you have people in your life you're able to approach if you have a problem, whether it's practical or emotional or any problem of any kind. Social factors, we know, for example, that people, that socioeconomic status impacts on mental health. That's not because poor people are likely to be less happy. It's all the mediating stressors that go along with poverty. So people are more likely to be living in overcrowded accommodation. They might not have access to good, healthy diets. They might not have access to education. They might not have access to good food, to exercise facilities, for, all those kinds of things. So it's all those mediating factors that are important. Okay, so we've got this interaction between biological, psychological and social factors. It's very little to do with how strong or how weak you are. When we look at those kinds of factors, when we try and define them, it's very, very difficult to pin down. So there's no more likelihood that Charles is going to struggle with his mental health than I am, just because we're different personalities. So I just want to talk briefly, and I'm completely forgetting how long I have. When am I due to finish, Catherine?
12.
Okay,
12.
Brilliant, thank you. I just want to talk briefly about what a mental health problem is. So we all have mental health. We all struggle at times with things going on in life. When does it become a mental health problem? There's difference, of course, between emotional distress and a diagnosable mental health problem. I think we need to hold in mind that for the most part, seafarers are not mentally ill. And as Sandra said, they're not more likely necessarily to become mentally ill just because they're a seafarer. There are risks and stressors attached to a life at sea, but there's nothing, there isn't a greater, they're not a special kind of person who are more likely to get mentally ill. They're in a social environment which is very specific, which comes with challenges. But for the most part, they're not mentally ill. So where does emotional distress and a mental health problem sort of overlap, or where's the distinction? So when we're looking as mental health professionals around diagnosis, there are these three factors. One is around how pronounced or intense the symptoms might be. Crucially, it's kind of how persistent those symptoms are. And the most important thing is how they impact on your day-to-day functioning. So we talk about our ability to function in daily life. So it's things like, can you get up out of bed and go to work in the morning? Can you still write the emails you needed to write? Are you still going out to see your friends or doing your hobbies or doing the things that you normally do in life? When it starts to impact on our day-to-day functioning, That's the crucial bit around whether it might be diagnosable level of a problem or not. So it's how persistent it is, how long it goes on for, how much it interrupts our functioning, and how intense the symptoms are. One thing to really hold in mind is that many mental health problems are preventable. I'll mention in a minute some stuff around stress. But most mental health problems are also very treatable. So although we hear a lot about people struggling with their mental health, for example, PTSD is a bugbear of mine, because I worked in specialist trauma services in London for about 8 years. And when I hear on the news that somebody's got PTSD and it's going to affect them for life, it drives me insane, because PTSD is one of the most treatable mental health problems. That's why I liked it so much. We could help people, they could recover, they could go back to being what the kind of person they wanted to be. It's really treatable. So many mental health problems are treatable. Many mental health problems are preventable. I just wanted to stop and pause for a moment on thinking about depression. So what's on here is a kind of summary of the diagnostic criteria for depression. So this is how a psychologist or a psychiatrist, what the symptoms they would look at, what criteria they would look at. So for a diagnosis of depression, you have to have a number of these symptoms. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it's probably 6 of these symptoms. And they have to be there nearly every day and for at least 2 weeks before we would then say this could be a diagnosable level of depression. But look at the symptoms. I won't get you to raise your hands, but how many people in this room do you think have never experienced any of those symptoms? No one. Those symptoms, that's part of what it is to be human, isn't it? Those symptoms are normal, aren't they? We call them symptoms when we're looking at them in a mental health professional perspective. But feelings of hopelessness or pessimism, when bad news happens, you kind of think, oh, am I ever going to get through this? This is normal. It's normal experience. Having problems with sleep because something's on your mind, having trouble concentrating because something's distracting you. Many of these symptoms are just normal day-to-day experience. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about a mental health problem, depression, a diagnosable mental health problem, but we all experience these symptoms. There's nothing different about them. When it becomes diagnosable, it's when those symptoms persist over time. So at least 2 weeks in the case of a diagnosis for depression, and when you're experiencing them a lot, so all day, every day, or at least a lot of the time, okay? And crucially, when it starts to get in the way of your ability to do the things you normally do on a day-to-day basis, whether that's within your family, your relationships, your work, or your leisure time. Does that sort of make sense? So if we're thinking about seafarers, what do we know about seafarers? Well, we know they're human, so they're as likely to struggle with their mental health as anyone else. Sandra already mentioned the ITF Seafarers Trust study. It was a relatively small sample size, so they only had about 1,500 seafarers responded to it. But it was very academically rigorous study. It's one of the best studies still that's out there. 28% of seafarers had a diagnosable level of depression, and 20% had a diagnosable level of anxiety. Yeah. The calls to the ICE 1 helpline, and as part of my role, what I've been doing for the last few years, 5 years or more, is supervising the Seafarer Help team. Seafarer Help is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week helpline for seafarers, and so I supervise that team. I do reflective practice groups with them, and I give individual supervision to the staff on that helpline. And during the pandemic, you can see that calls that related to suicide tripled during that time. They've come back down a bit, but last year they reported that 19 calls around suicide. I expect it will be higher this year. I don't know what the figures are at the moment, but I know in reflective practice for the last few months we've been talking a lot about ongoing cases of people that have contacted the helpline for help with suicidal thoughts and have needed repatriation. The other study that has come out more recently is the Marine Benefits Study. Now, this study basically replicated the Yale University study. It's not published in peer-reviewed journals, which is unfortunate, but it pretty much replicated the Yale study, and interestingly they had 27 companies and nearly 17,000 seafarers responded. And what's interesting for me is that the figures are very similar, they're not that different. So about 23% screening positive for diagnosable level of depression and about 19% anxiety. What the Marine Benefits Study also did, though, was they included a stress measure. Now, I think this could have been better just looking at it from the rigour from an academic research point of view. But actually what's interesting is that you can see that seafarers on average reported a very high level of stress. So the cut-off point for extreme stress was 20. On average, seafarers reported 19.5, scored 19.5 on the scale that they used. Now, stress is not a mental health problem as such. It's not a diagnosable mental health problem, but it is implicated in a whole gamut of physical and mental health problems. So we know very well that stress contributes to mental health problems and to physical health problems. So for me, a figure like that is really alarming. If seafarers are that stressed on average, why wouldn't there be a problem? There was one kind of a survey that was done by the Mental Health Foundation quite recently that estimated about 66% of people with a diagnosable mental health problem reported that work-related stress contributed to it. So for me, this idea about stress in seafarers is really important. So we really need to look at, what are the stressors for seafarers and what can we do about them. It is a difficult job, but if there's stressors layered upon stress and layered upon more stress, there's a breaking point that everybody is likely to have. Managing stress is always about managing the causes of stress and about having good coping strategies with stress. It's not either or. We can't just train seafarers to cope with stress and keep piling more and more stress on top of them. We need to look at how do we reduce the stress that seafarers are under. So for me, this is a really important thing and something we really need to look at a bit more effectively. The CIRC study that came out in 2019. So, when I first, as I mentioned, when I first started working or getting interested in seafarer mental health, we started with those guidelines for seafarers. Now, this is great because it's about educating people, it's about mental health promotion, it's about how can you keep yourself mentally well and what do you do if you're struggling. But I'm going the wrong way. There we are. But it was actually this study that got us thinking and talking about, but actually, what are companies doing to reduce stress on seafarers, to reduce or mitigate against stress? The CIRC study said that more than 50% of employer stakeholders said they hadn't introduced any practices or policies relating to seafarer mental health in the previous 10 years. 3/4 of them said that it just hadn't been identified as a priority. And 90% of those people hadn't introduced any policies at all. So admittedly, this is 2019 and we're now 4 years on, but I would be really interested to know how that's changed. I think awareness has dramatically changed and that's brilliant. So hopefully it has changed, but I would be really interested to know how far has it changed. If we're thinking about health and safety in a UK context, the health and safety, and so in the UK, the health and safety executive mandate that employers do a stress risk assessment. Did you know that? I only found that out a few years ago, that actually employers by law should have done a stress risk assessment and should be putting in measures to mitigate against stress. So as a result of that kind of thinking around kind of, well, what actually we're teaching seafarers to cope with stress, but how can we address the stress that they're under? I wrote this Mentally Healthy Ships guide. Now, some of you may have come across that. It was in part funded by some of the P&I groups. So you may have come across it, you may have read it. It's free to download on the ICE1 website. So if you haven't seen it, Google it, you'll come across it. But in that is a fundamental idea that the company and the individual have a shared responsibility for mental health. So for all of us, we obviously have a responsibility to look after our own health, our own physical health, our own mental health, but also our employer has a responsibility towards us not to put us in a dangerous situation that is likely to cause a health problem or a physical health problem. So in there, there are various ideas about prevention, about promotion, about response. Okay, so there's lots and lots there, and I won't go through all of them, and I am going to end up running over time, however, even though I had plenty of time. So have a look through those, and promotion is around, so prevention is around things like engaging crew in the process, thinking about what's causing stress, thinking about how can we mitigate against that. One of the things that came up earlier was around crewing, around voyage-only contracts, that income stability and job security is a big part of what makes us feel safe and secure in life. It's knowing that we can pay the bills at the end of the month, that our kids can go to school, that we have enough money to feed the children. Without that job security or income security, those things are a constant worry, aren't they? And they impact on our life and our behaviour and how we manage. So there's all manner of things in prevention that we can look at. In promotion, that's more around the kind of the psychological well-being at sea and guides, and how do we promote mental health awareness, how do we teach people tools and strategies for looking after themselves, How do we provide facilities so that people can keep themselves mentally well? Is there good food on board? Are there good access to exercise facilities? Are there ways of getting out and seeing the light if you work in the engine room? Whatever those things might be. Is there access to healthcare? All those kinds of stuff. And then the response mechanisms are about having response mechanisms in place so that if people are struggling, they're able to access help and support easily and confidentially. What are those response mechanisms? One thing I wanted to mention is this kind of assurance of fair treatment and return to work, and Sandra touched on it earlier on, and you may not be able to see much of what's in that left-hand side part, but what it is I've just copy-pasted a whiteboard from one of the trainings that I do on maritime mental health awareness. And in the MMHA training, we look at stigma. We ask people, if we've all got mental health, why don't we talk about it? And these are things that came up. Now, if I can see, one of them there is about, where is it? Oops, I've touched the wrong thing. No, go back. Oh no, now I'm not right at the beginning now.
5 moments.
So one of them there, excuse me, where is it? Here we are. We fear people will think we're not capable of our job or we can't cope. We worry about the impact on promotion and job contracts. Now that comes up without fail every single time I do a training, and I have done more than 120 trainings with an average of 20 seafarers in every one. So about 2,500 seafarers I've done this kind of training with, and that comes up every single time, that they're worried about speaking out or asking for help because of the impact on their job. For officers and people who are in permanent contracts, they're worried they won't get a promotion, or they're worried that people will think they're unprofessional, or they're worried that they won't get the next ticket, that kind of thing. For people who are on voyage-only contracts, they worry they're not going to get another contract. That's it. If they say, I'm struggling with my mental health, they'll get put off the ship and they won't get another contract. That's their livelihood gone. That's a massive disincentive from asking for help. So somehow we have to give people a level of reassurance that we're going to treat them fairly. That doesn't mean we're going to say, oh, it doesn't matter. What was your example? Somebody attacked a pilot? You know, it doesn't mean we're going to say that's acceptable behaviour. What it does mean is that when they've taken a leave of absence, for example, we then have a look at what is their mental health like now, in the same way that we would do with physical health. Are they fit? Are they well enough to return to the vessel? Do they have the coping strategies? Have they had the help and support that they needed? What would they do in future if they found themselves in a similar set of circumstances? What have they learned? These kinds of things. So we can do a proper mental health assessment at that point and give some recommendations. We can come up with some conclusions. The decision about whether somebody goes back to sea, of course, is always going to have to rest with the company and the level of risk that company is willing to take around that. But a good mental health assessment with somebody that actually has the experience to carry out one of those assessments can give pretty good idea of where the person is at with their mental health and whether they're going to be able to cope going back on board. And just before I finish, I wanted to mention one more example. And this example I've borrowed from a colleague of mine, Rachel Glynn Williams, who is, you may have come across, she's a consultant clinical psychologist as well. She's based up in Liverpool. And she's worked with Alandia Insurance on critical incident management in seafarers. They did a brief survey of seafarers, so it wasn't a massive study, it wasn't academically rigorous, but it was a survey they were doing in order to look at critical incident management. And there's some interesting things that come out there. 50% of the seafarers that responded to the survey said they'd experienced at least one incident on board, which would have met criteria for a critical incident in the mental health term, that would qualify for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So they felt at risk to themselves or witnessing death or risk to the physical integrity of somebody else. So serious critical incidents. 37% of them said that they had had intrusive symptoms after. That means bad dreams, upsetting memories. 41% had had heightened physiological arousal symptoms, anxiety symptoms. So those are two of the key symptoms that we would diagnose post-traumatic stress from. But 57% of them said they hadn't received any support after that incident. Of the people that did get support, which was whatever it was, the overwhelming majority of those had got that support from their friends or their family, not from the company, not from mental health professionals, not from telemedical services. There wasn't company support there. One person commented, no, I did need support, but I wouldn't have used it. And then they were asked in the survey, well, why wouldn't you have used it if you didn't take it, if it was available to you? And he said, the company will dislike. So there we are. People won't access help and support unless they know it's safe to do so. So what happens here? If you look at the graph, you can see the number of people that said it affected their job performance, their performance at work. And in other parts of the study, it showed that actually people were talking about for periods of 1 month, 6 months, and even over a year. So there we are, we've got a significant proportion of people who have experienced critical incidents on board, who have got ongoing symptoms and have received no help, and it is affecting their work performance. I think we need to do something about that, don't we? Is that not the definition of risk on board a vessel? If you've got people in this situation who are trying to do their jobs, you know, there's a problem, isn't there? So I'm just raising this because I think it's really interesting, and I don't think as an industry yet we have got sophisticated enough in our thinking to actually start thinking about things like critical incidents response for the human beings that are involved, as well as the emergency response plans that are in place to mitigate against reputational damage and all those things. So these are my key messages. I'm stopping, I've overrun, I'm really sorry. These are my key messages here. So that's it from me. I just want to take the opportunity to introduce my very exciting new venture, which is I'm setting up a community interest company around mental health for seafarers. And so I just wanted to mention that to you all. I'm very excited about it, and I'd love to connect with anybody who is interested in connecting. So there we go. Thank you very much for your time.